Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ARCO Forum. Our topic tonight is governing and oversight, striking a balance. As someone myself who spent some time in the Congress, I'm going to rephrase that topic, since my own perspective on it right off is that oversight is an integral part of governing. It's not a trade-off in the process of governing in a democracy. And indeed, when it comes to the United States Congress, our Congress has among the greatest powers and the greatest tradition of exercising oversight of any legislative body probably in the world. Now, ideally, the purpose of oversight, of course, is to try to make sure the executive branch operates honestly, that it's carrying out the will of Congress and the will of the American people, and indeed sees that the laws are faithfully executed. It can, in that process, generate public debate on critical issues in the country. It can create the information and the political climate in which legislation can be passed, and it can bring into line public officials in the executive branch, the non-elected part of the government, into line with the collective will. Now, that's the ideal perspective on what oversight is to be all about. Of course, there's enormous controversy, and always has been in this country, over whether, in fact, the powers are exercised that way. In our system, oversight is handled in many different ways in the U.S. Congress. I just want to mention a couple because we probably won't get to most of them in our conversation here tonight. First, of course, the Congress itself has its own bureaucracy, the General Accounting Office, on which it has spent in the recent years somewhere between $350 and $450 million per year of professional teams who go in and audit the books, and not only for financial reasons, for policy reasons as well in the executive branch. Then, of course, the individual members of the Congress in the House and Senate. They and their personal staffs engage on a daily basis, and I dare say there are hundreds, if not thousands, of pending inquiries from individual offices in various parts of the federal branch today. One of the more popular examples of that was the Golden Fleece Award that Senator Proxmire of Wisconsin used to come out with once a month. His critics said it was nothing but a press release. Those who admired his work thought that he did a great service in finding corruption or excessive expenditures in the federal government. Then, of course, there is the more organized, professional, ongoing efforts of each of the committees of Congress who authorize programs within the jurisdiction of their program, and they have, in some cases, extensive investigatory staffs to carry this out. But perhaps the place that we will end up talking tonight has to do with the fact that Congress oftentimes will set up ad hoc or special committees to take on special issues of prominent political or substantive importance in the country. The impact that oversight has had in our system, of course, has in many cases been extraordinary and sometimes petty. But the fact is that it's unquestionably had an impact on policy in this country, and not only how we govern, but who governs. During the Civil War, President Lincoln had to contend with a joint committee on the conduct of the war. It was so difficult for the administration and the Union cause between the relationships of the executive and the Congress over this that Robert E. Lee even announced that he thought that committee provided 2 additional divisions to the South. In the case of the Second World War, however, Senator Truman came to head up what was called the Truman Committee to investigate the conduct of the war. And indeed, the reviews of that effort of congressional oversight are, by and large, highly favorable, that millions and millions of dollars were saved for the taxpayers in the prosecution of that effort. But not only is there an impact on the conduct of the executive and the policy, but also on who governs in this country, because the oversight function has provided many opportunities to bring up or bring down American political leaders. Of course, it was the Truman Committee that brought to fame Harry Truman, who became vice presidential candidate and ultimately president of the United States. It was Richard Nixon, of course, on the House Un-American Activities Committee as a congressman, who came to national prominence through the investigations of that committee, and who then indeed later had lived by the sword and died by the sword. It was the congressional or senatorial Watergate investigation, not to mention, of course, the Washington Post and the the special prosecutor, who ended up bringing his political career to a close. It was John F. Kennedy, a senator, who enhanced his national prominence in the labor racketeering hearings at that time. And indeed, our current vice president began his career in the House of Representatives in a very extensive effort and oversight on the Commerce Committee. Well, this provides great occasion for conflict between the executive and the legislature, and indeed, the perspectives on both ends are radically different often as to what is in fact occurring. It was President Kennedy who said that when he was on the Senate and as a senator of Pennsylvania Avenue, he thought the Congress looked awfully weak in its ability to oversee the activities of the executive branch. When he was in the White House, he thought they looked terribly strong. Well, tonight we'll probably get a flavor of that difference of opinion. We're very pleased to have with us tonight a number of people who have been on one or the other or both ends of the Pennsylvania Avenue in terms of the oversight function. We'll first be hearing from Harold Ickes. He is, of course, a lawyer, a political strategist, and most recently a presidential advisor, where he has been assistant, as I think people are well aware, to President Clinton. He was assistant to the president and deputy chief of staff for political affairs and policy for 3 years. And indeed, recently testified before the Senate Thompson Committee, where, much to the frustration of his critics, was highly applauded by his friends and others for his skill at handling that very difficult situation. We'll then hear from Philip Hyman, who was on the faculty of the Harvard Law School. He has spent a great deal of his career in the federal government and has had a number of high-level positions at the Justice Department, both during the Carter administration and the Clinton administration. But he earlier on had experience as an associate prosecutor with the special prosecutor in the Watergate affair, where he worked closely with the various investigative efforts, congressional and executive, in terms of the Watergate. So when he was at the Justice Department later, however, he felt the investigatory power of the Senate and the House, and on a number of occasions had to testify as to the activities of the Justice Department. We'll then hear from Ricky Seidman, who is currently a fellow at the Institute of Politics. And Ricky has had a number of incarnations, but she's actually been on both ends of congressional oversight. Earlier in her career, she was a chief investigator for the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee, where obviously she led a number of investigations of the executive branch. Later, when she worked for President Clinton in the White House in several different positions, she found herself on the other end of the investigatory process. Then finally, certainly last but far, far from least, is Congressman Bill Thomas from California, who we're pleased is just driven in to be with us, and by the way will be with us tomorrow at the Institute of Politics as well. And Congressman Thomas serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, where he chairs the subcommittee on health, and he's very much engaged in trade, health, and tax matters, and does a lot of oversight in effort as well as legislating in these policy areas. But he's also chairman of the House Oversight Committee. That's not to be confused with the House Reform and Oversight Committee. The committee he chairs actually oversees the internal operations of the U.S. House of Representatives, though they also have responsibility for campaign finance law. I should mention in our audience, and as one of our fellows, we have Congressman Bill Klinger, former Congressman Klinger, who had served as chairman of the Reform and Oversight Committee of the House of Representatives, and he's a fellow at the IOP now, in case I didn't say that enough times, and somebody that you can talk to on any day of the week. Well, with these experienced folks, I think we ought to be able to find out and probably get a little difference of opinion, I trust, on when does Congress act in the public interest, and when does it seem to be interfering in ways that do not serve the public interest? With that, let me turn to Harold Ickes.
Thank you, Phil. I will be brief because I actually am more interested in hearing your questions than hearing myself talk, and it's more informative to hear from you. But let me first of all comment about the term oversight. I'm going to be a little partisan here tonight. Because my experience basically is from the White House end of it. Fortunately, I have not had much oversight taken of me or institutions I've worked for until I came to the White House, and that basically is what grounded my experience. I had not thought of it in terms of oversight, quite frankly. My experience had been that was investigation. And so I'm interested to hear your term, Phil, that it is oversight.
Congressional point of view.
Indeed it is. There's no question that congressional oversight is not only legitimate, it is historically grounded, but it is also necessary, as is a very strong investigative press. I think that I would probably not get a round of applause from my former colleagues at the White House for my saying that, given what this White House has been through in the last 4.5 or 5 years. But the fact is that it is legitimate and it is in fact necessary. And notwithstanding the fact that you sometimes don't want to answer questions, you sometimes don't want to give up information from the point of view of the public trust and making sure that public resources are used as they are supposed to be used, you need that function. It also is a very informative function. Just the oversight and investigation process itself can yield a great deal of very helpful information for the public at large. I think where we get into problems is when oversight or investigation, and I will use those terms interchangeably, become highly partisan. And I would underline the word highly as well as partisan, because there I think we get into a problem of losing the public trust, of losing the public interest, and increasing public cynicism. And I think the public has a very good nose for what is too highly partisan and what is legitimate. I think we could spend an awful lot of time here tonight among this panel itself, as well as members of the audience, discussing what is highly partisan and what is, and I will use the word in quotes, legitimate. But the real danger is not the legal bills people run up and the reputations that may be brought low by an overly zealous or overly partisan investigation or oversight, use what term you want, but the result it has on the public. That, I think, is a very, very grave consequence, and I think that the members of Congress or any oversight committee or any oversight investigatory body, especially one that is mandated by the public or sanctioned by the public, has to be very, very aware of that. Frankly, my view is, and it is a partisan view, and I'm sure there will be some disagreement from members of this panel, as certainly in some members of the audience. I think that the Whitewater oversight or investigation has been driven primarily, if not exclusively, by highly partisan motivation. I think initially there was some raison d'etre for an investigation in that area, but it has long, in my view, run its course. And quite frankly, I think that the continuation of the campaign finance situation is basically a continuation of that in another form, in another forum, but basically with the purposes of trying to tarnish the president and, more importantly at this point, to tarnish the vice president with 2000 in mind. I grant that that is a very harsh and stark view, but it is certainly my view, having been through a lot of it. I was telling some of my colleagues here tonight, I have, since coming to Washington, D.C., I have testified under oath in various forums. I think the Senate was my 16th time. I didn't start down here in Washington until 1994. But that's a lot of oversight and a lot of investigation, and I'm sure there are those here who will say it's warranted. I think there are two, other than the public, the impact on the public and public cynicism, I think two things really have to be borne in mind. One is the impact on people themselves, on their reputations and on their pocketbooks. They are often left in the breach, and I'm not holding out a wet towel here for people, but the fact is that irresponsible oversight or irresponsible investigation can have very, very severe consequences on people's reputation. And I'm not talking about necessarily the principals, the president or the vice president or the first lady or the head of an agency. I'm talking about people who are underneath that, who often are drawn in unwittingly. And so I think the oversight committees, and I think on balance they do this, have a real need to exercise a real responsibility in that regard, and I think by and large most congressional oversight hearings do that. The other is the impact on the institutions. The impact of oversight or investigation on an institution, again, I speak from very limited experience, but a very intense experience, can be very harsh indeed. It is my view that some of the oversight or investigations conducted by the Congress with respect to both Whitewater and the congressional or the campaign finance situation were motivated in part by some to try to tie up the White House, to try to deflect public attention, to try to tie up the White House, and to try to tie up the DNC. Again, you know, that's something that the public ultimately has to make a decision on because it's a highly partisan atmosphere, and reasonable people can differ with respect to what's reasonable, what's not reasonable, what's excessive, what's not excessive, what's overly partisan, and what's, quote, legitimate, close quote. But the impact on an institution, I take the White House and the DNC, basically when I stepped off the airplane in January of 1994, I came down to help manage the healthcare initiative. The first job that Mac McClarty gave me was that afternoon. It was a Monday afternoon, I'll never forget it. He says, Harold, we got a problem with Whitewater. Just start dealing with it, keep me abreast of it, I don't want to get involved in it. And literally that just tied up my time for the next 3 or 4 months, not completely, but virtually completely. And what I did was basically form a unit within the White House, damage control unit staffed by ultimately about 10 lawyers. And that all they did was deal with subpoenas, gathering information, sifting through documents, responding not only to congressional, but to independent counsel, et cetera. On the DNC is a little more graphic. The DNC has been required to review some 5 million documents in their files, in the various files. They've hired a large law firm to do it. They have submitted over 500,000 pieces of paper to the investigation committees of Congress. They have run up over $10 million in legal fees. Again, does Congress have a right to do that? Yes. It seems to me the broader question is, what is the purpose of the investigation? And if the purpose of the investigation is to highlight some areas that may need correction and then go on to propose serious legislation to deal with campaign finance reform, and I think there are areas that it needs to be reformed in, quite frankly, and much of the American people think that as well, that's all well and good. Fundamentally, I have concluded, as have many others, that the primary purpose of the investigation of the DNC has been to try to lock it up, tie it down, and to bankrupt it. And I think I will give those people whose intentions were to do that, I give them an A+. They've done a damn good job of it. And when you see what the Republicans were able to put into the recent special election in Staten Island, the congressional race, as well as New Jersey and Virginia races, compared to what the Democratic National Committee was able to do, I think that they achieved their purpose in that regard. So that's just a very brief view from one person's point of view. Coming back, however, I think it is fair to say that most congressional investigations are fair, legitimate, and carried out under honest rules, and they serve a very, very legitimate public purpose.
Thank you, Harold. Phil?
I'm going to agree with an awful lot of what Harold has to say, so I can perhaps be even shorter. I'd like to begin. I think the reason I'm on this panel is because there's a case study in the Kennedy School of me when I was head of the criminal division called Congressional Oversight. And in the Congressional Oversight case, I'm running the criminal division, and Senator Biden's staff comes and says, well, this is, we're about to approve your budget. At that time, you didn't have an annual authorization hearing. And I said, why don't you have an oversight hearing? Which now gets a lot of laughs out of students. Because I thought we were doing things so well, I thought, wouldn't it be nice to have an oversight hearing where I could tell about all the good things we were doing. They said, "Are you sure you want an oversight hearing?" And I said, yeah, that would be a great idea, have an oversight hearing. By the time I was through, I had President Carter in the midst of a spirited attack, a demand for papers that went directly to his basic honesty, claims by Robert Vesco. It was not a good idea. And I had sort of assumed it would be nonpartisan and admiring. It was highly partisan. It was bitterly fought, and I wasn't the object of it. The object of it was the president. Well, what I want to do is divide oversight hearings into several categories. That's one thing that Harold didn't do. There are oversight hearings on issues. Is the Defense Department spending too much on this and that? Are we enforcing clean food laws? Is the Immigration and Naturalization Service doing something terrible? On the whole, these are troublesome to the agency. They're hated by the agency, but they've got to be a healthy thing in a democracy. They've got to be very healthy. The enemies there are complacency and ineffectiveness by a government agency. Every agency tends to do it. The Soviet Union collapsed because of an absence of oversight hearings, if you like, and a system that didn't work otherwise. You need to be able to, things need to be challenged. There's a special role of oversight in scandal. Now we're getting close to where the problems start to become as big as the opportunities. I've worked in a lot of countries where there's, perhaps because there's a parliamentary system, there's no legislative oversight. There's no step in those countries between a newspaper allegation that is likely to be false based on rumor, maybe true, and any fact-finding, any ultimate determination of what happened. The countries live in sort of a strange world that swirl with rumors and attacks, and nobody knows what's going on. Between when there is suspicion of a serious scandal, it is important to have a body, and for us it's the legislature, particularly when it's the hands of a party different from the administration, that can look into that. A step between a rumor and a prosecution, something in the middle. But finally, there's the category of allegations of administration wrongdoing. And these turn out to be very dangerous, whatever party is doing the oversight. The reason is very simple. The temptations are immense. The payoff in terms of the party out of executive power and the payoffs for representatives or senators, personally, are likely, because of the newsworthiness of the target, are likely to be very great. And that's the category that we're basically thinking about when we say, when the title of this session becomes governance or oversight, or something like that. Those are troublesome categories. It's a little like what Churchill said about democracy. It's the worst possible system except for the others. And the question is, what are the benefits and what are the harms? Well, I've sort of mentioned the benefits, but what are the harms? Let me just run through them, just as a reminder of why we have to worry about oversight and not simply admire it as a way of keeping. We have an American tradition of suspecting the executive, so anything that beats up on the executive we sort of like in general. But what's it cost us? And oversight does that. Sometimes oversight hearings can be very unfair. I think Chairman Dingell, Democrat, ran very unfair hearings of David Baltimore and a Nobel Prize winner, and whether he had placed his name on a piece of erroneous and false scientific investigation. He wouldn't let Baltimore. He wouldn't let Baltimore talk. He used every device he could to make his own case. Can be very unfair. That's also an example to for a way of saying that it can set priorities for the executive branch to avoid the danger of attack on the Hill, which are bad priorities. The very courageous Health and Human Services Department immediately set up a special agency to crack down on scientific fraud and populated it with people who knew nothing about science and did nothing but make mischief for 2 years until they were removed. You can have a major effect on the morale of an institution. To be investigated if you're the Justice Department or HHS or Agriculture over a long period of time does very serious damage to the institution itself. That happened, again, if I can go back to Democrats attacking Republicans, that happened towards the end of the Bush administration to the Justice Department. It was in some shambles. Harold mentioned the dollar cost to participants. He was much more vivid talking before dinner about what it is costing people who are working in the White House. Who would take such a job? How will we staff the government if you really have to spend, if you have to anticipate spending $200,000 or $250,000 or more defending, appearing as a witness in a congressional hearing? Time consumed. Harold mentioned that. I don't have to say anything more about it, but you can tie up an administration completely. One of the worries about having an independent counsel is the extent to which it would tie up the president. We want our presidents to do work. We want our vice presidents to do work. And I guess the last one I want to mention, it's not so important, but it's sort of funny, and that's the special problem of people keeping diaries. The special problem of privacy that's involved. We no longer protect diaries. I was part of the Vince Foster investigation involving Whitewater. I was in a very comfortable role, but it came as something of a surprise to me that my special assistant had been keeping a daily diary, a young woman who I brought down from law school. She had been keeping a daily diary of everything that was going on, everything I was doing. And the committee subpoenaed the diary. I mean, it was all fine, but it made me a little nervous when I found out that they were reading a daily report of everything I'd done. So there is some privacy side too. I quit with that. I hope that the list suggests that there are serious dangers there. It's tempting to say, well, what we need is oversight, but responsible oversight, but that's a cop-out. We're going to have oversight. I guess maybe it's the only thing we can do. Try for responsibility. But the stakes are very high when it gets to be an allegation of scandal by an administration, by the highest levels of an administration, and that's the time when we're least likely to get responsibility.
Ricky Seidel.
Well, I agree with just about everything Harold and Phil said, so I'll be very brief. Actually, what I chose as my topic is something that is a much narrower look at this issue than they spoke about and that Congressman Thomas, I think, will speak about. I think it speaks for itself that oversight is an important function of the Congress. It's important that we know that that's part of the whole idea of separation of powers. It's important that we know that our laws are that Congress knows that the laws are being enforced the way they intended them when they were passed. It's important that they know that agencies are operating in ways that are honest and above board and pursuing the goals of those agencies. I don't want to get into anything that really deals with that. What I want to talk about briefly tonight is one of the side effects that Phil touched on briefly and Harold touched on that concerns me, and it's very self-interested one, let's say, but also one that I think many of you who may go on to work for politicians and elected officials might experience, and that is the role of the staff and really the demonization of the staff of an elected official. And I worked for Bill Clinton in the White House. I worked for Ted Kennedy in the Senate and had experience at both those places as a participant in the investigations being investigated. As Phil mentioned, I worked at I was the chief investigator for the Senate Labor Committee and did some oversight in that extent. And like I said, I think that most oversight is good oversight. But focusing on these investigations that have been going on now, let's first think about what a staffer is. I mean, most people, until recently, haven't thought about that very much at all, because one of the first things that you learn as a staffer, and the whole idea of a staffer, is to be anonymous. Really, it's someone who is going to help the elected official get their job done. I'm a person who has very strong beliefs and opinions, but when I decided that I was going to work for Bill Clinton, I made a commitment to work for him, and it wasn't my ideas that I was promoting or my policies, it was his policies. And I think that that's something that every person who decides to staff a politician makes that commitment, that really it's your principal whose positions you're committed to carrying out. If you're lucky, they may ask you for your opinion one day, but they might not, actually. And often you find, even with things that you strongly believe, what you believe is not relevant. But in all of my political experience, in terms of setting aside my my ideological positions or my advocacy of a certain policy, I have never been asked to set aside my integrity. And I know of no politician who asks their staff to set aside their integrity. And I think a lot of the investigations and the hearings that have gone on are ones that assume that the politicians have asked their staffs to set aside their integrity. Let me give one example of something where I think this is something that goes too far. It came up in the investigation, the hearings that were held on Vince Foster's suicide, where a woman named Maggie Williams, who was the who was the chief of staff for the First Lady, most of you know who she is. She's been pilloried all over the Hill. Spent hours in depositions and was asked in hearings repeatedly what she did the night that Vince Foster died. I was lucky I didn't have to participate in those hearings. Maggie Williams was very close professionally to Vince Foster. I was there at the White House the night that Vince Foster committed suicide until 1 o'clock in the morning, and I actually gave Maggie a ride home that night. I know for a fact that Maggie did not take any documents out of Vince's office. I was there, I saw it, and I watched, and this was after I had left the White House, and so I could, had the liberty to watch it from CNN from California, over and over, Maggie having to answer questions about something like that. There's no good reason for that, to me, other than pure partisanship. There are definite downsides, and my colleagues have already spoken to that in terms of having to have an attorney. That is not something that most people think about when they think about going to work for the government. Now in Washington, and this is really not a joke, but sometimes it's hard to find an attorney because there are so many people representing your colleagues, then they don't want to create a conflict. And there's no one who's paying those legal bills except for you, and it is actually against the law for you to take pro bono legal assistance, because then that would be the potential of someone giving you a favor for which you might have to do a favor for them in government. So it is a personal hardship of great real and financial expense, and it takes a tremendous amount of time from what your job is, what you're there to do. But as much as anything else, in the same sense that I think watching a lot of these hearings have been detrimental to the public's perspective on government. It also saps even the strongest people, your energy and your ability to do your job, which is to serve the American people. What do I think needs to be done? I mean, I think that a good part of this is been raised more recently because of the divided government and the tension when you have a Republican Congress and a Democratic president, and the Congress, it's a way for the Congress to tie the president's hands and to keep his focus from being on other things. You know, I sat here thinking about tonight and what I thought was a way for Congress and the president to address their various differences. And it made me think maybe we should have a system like they have in Britain, where the prime minister goes to the well I think it's every Thursday afternoon. There's a question period. It actually goes to the well as a House term. A question period where the prime minister answers the questions of the members of the House of Commons. And any of you have ever watched it, they used to show it on C-SPAN. It's incredibly rowdy and no holds barred, and you can see that everyone is taking out they throw their worst and strongest shots, and the chips fall where they may, and it's once a week and they get it over with. And that, to me, may be a better way for Congress and the president to deal with each other too. But there has to be some answer to the situation that we have now, because not only are we driving wonderfully qualified people from running for public office, we're driving really dedicated public servants from serving our government, and the bottom line is that we're further deteriorating the public trust in our political system.
Thank you, Ricky. Congressman Thomas.
Thanks, Phil. Tomorrow I'll be talking with my friend Bill Klinger's classes, and I'll be focusing primarily on what Phil called the first of the oversight areas, the issues, which are not what most people have been talking about. I enjoy those kinds of oversight hearings. I have a lot of them. The most recent one was the first-year review of the new fraud and abuse powers that we have given both the Healthcare Financing Administration and the Health and Human Services Inspector General, and whether or not those powers were working the way we had hoped they were going to work, and what could we do with the midterm correction to make them work better. It was a very positive, cooperative, open oversight hearing, and we learned much about what we should have done, except we didn't know about it until after we tried to put it into effect, and what they believe would be a better way of accomplishing it. I've got some other materials that I want to share with you from the House oversight position, not just using, as Phil Sharp called, the Congress's bureaucracy, because frankly, when Republicans came into power, they were a little sickened, frankly, by the number of GAO folk who came in and suddenly realized that they had been not as responsive to the Republicans as they should have been, and that they were now more than willing to investigate those areas that they never had time to investigate, and frankly, they're sycophants. And so what we have tried to do is set up for ourselves. As you may know, when we took over, we professionalized the House of Representatives, and we use outside auditors, Price Waterhouse and others, which really makes it real, and frankly, very difficult. But more importantly, when you get results, they're out in the open, and then you have to talk about how you're going to deal with changing them, since it was a professional third-party analysis, and you have to swallow hard and accept it. We're trying to do the same with other areas of the federal government. As a matter of fact, in HHS, they're trying to go through that for the first time. It's very difficult for them also to accept the findings of outside third parties, not their own internal review processes. I think it's very positive because it removes any kind of a gotcha arrangement between Congress and the executive branch. It creates more of how can we resolve the problem that these folks we both don't like but have decided to allow to examine us. It creates, I think, some bonds that otherwise aren't there when third parties examine the question. I guess, Ricky, I have a little difficulty. I don't doubt at all what you said from a personal point of view. But you seem to think that it's only occurred to the Democrats since the Republicans gained the majority in Congress. What happened for the more than 40 years when between 1952 and today there were only 10 years of divided government, quote unquote, with Democrats in the White House? They also had a Democratic Congress, so they didn't experience those kinds of things. But Republicans who were in those Republican administrations spent a lot of money trying to defend themselves against charges that were outrageous. John Dingell was mentioned, Jack Brooks is another example. There were a lot of staffers who were destroyed. I didn't really hear the arguments then about how we really need to change the system. And so I guess we've come full circle when in fact the shoe is on the other foot. You realize that a lot of the concerns and complaints that we had been making over the years about the outrageous way people had utilized investigatory powers, October Surprise comes to mind, in which more than $2 million was spent examining for over a year something that in fact wound up not having anything happen. I think most of those kinds of investigations, and probably it would fall under a combination of Phil's scandal and administrative wrongdoings, are almost always driven by staff, fueled by members' egos, but driven by staff in an attempt to glorify members. Those are the worst kinds of operations, and frankly, most of the investigations run by Congress when the Democrats were in power were exactly that. Now, what happened is they honed over the years great skills in terms of carrying out those kinds of activities. One of the problems I think Republicans have had since we've come in is that we aren't very good at it. And I'm glad, because I don't want us to develop those kinds of skills, the ability to personally destroy people without a clear understanding of why you are investigating. Because that was what was done for many, many years. There were people who had to spend their own money. There were people who had careers ruined. But we didn't get the ability to bring a focus on when the Democrats ran the operation. I think there are a couple of problems with the current system. I normally don't like to advocate adopting most anything in the British or the English system. It just doesn't convert well. But there is one practice which I think if we could ever develop it, it would be a very, very positive thing for our system. And that is within the English government, when a mistake is discovered, when an error has been made, even if it isn't the individual and they have responsibility over that area, they then personally take responsibility and resign. If we had the ability to do that with people who have made mistakes, rather than creating the fortress, rather than taking an argument, well, everybody does it, which, by the way, is one of the greatest destroyers of all of those personal reputations that are sitting there, because an everybody does it charge is not a laser. It is a nuclear explosion that blasts everybody in positions of responsibility who now have to defend themselves against the argument, well, you're like everybody else because you've done it. Why don't they just walk away and allow the American people to see someone for once stand up and say, I apologize, I abused my public position, and I hereby resign. That's the one thing from the English system that I think we should adopt. One of the real difficulties I have in most oversights, as I have with pilot programs and with demonstration projects, is that there is no thought beforehand why you're doing it, except for the fact that someone wants a bridge, so you put the bridge in. Somebody is going to do a study of Veterans Administration hospitals, so do it in my area. And that's how you wind up putting these packages together. If we would take approaches which would be much more like we would in some kind of a science project or even in the behavioral sciences with the methodology, why are we doing it? What are the goals? Clearly stated purpose. We are investigating for this legislative end. If you would structure it that way, then I think people could see where you're trying to go. Now, frankly, there are a number of them that aren't sure of where they're trying to go. Those are the ones that probably shouldn't be advanced. But one of the difficulties I think we also have is that we're in an entirely different era. Phil mentioned a couple of names from the past. I'll mention two others. Estes Kefauver, senator from Tennessee with the Kefauver hearings, which he was able to promote to a really good shot at getting on the national ticket with the coonskin cap and being up in New Hampshire in the winter. In the early 50s, one of my early vivid memories of television. And actually, back then, Senate hearings were pretty good TV, as were National Party conventions. Occupied prime time, 4 days. But compare the 1950s impact. You say, well, Watergate wasn't too bad. Well, Watergate was 25 years ago. It was pre-MTV and all the rest. Today, you don't have National Party conventions covered like you used to in the 50s. And guess what? You don't have the investigative hearings covered like you used to. They're still in large part driven by people who have a personal agenda along with the exposure agenda, but it's just not good. Senator Baker, even as late as Watergate, was able to take his very responsible role and create a model for himself and for others as an appropriate senator, and made a short run for the presidency as well. So although there is no argument, as I've heard here clearly, and as you will find if you spend any time, on the ability of Congress to investigate, to hold oversight, either through the appropriation of money, which we're responsible for, make sure it's well spent, or the fact that we create all those departments and agencies. The difficulty is the way in which these hearings are now being carried out on both sides. Harold complained about the time, 4.5 to 5 years, that some of those investigations have going on. Frankly, in the old days, they were covered in about a year or a year and a half. There wasn't the kind of stonewalling that went on. There wasn't this business of slowly dribbling out information, or of then trying to argue that notwithstanding what the video says, there was no controlling legal authority. There was no attempt to withhold information, and then after the focus has been on that information, it comes up, because TV is a moment. When that moment passes, even though that information becomes public, it doesn't have the impact. We're dealing with people who are the best at manipulating the media anyone who has been around longer than I have, and I've only been there 20 years, has ever seen. They are superb at it. The problem is Congress has a short timeline. The American public has an even shorter attention span. And someone in the White House has learned that you take those two ingredients, you can literally control what is or is not done through oversight hearings in the Congress. It's a body that is not nearly equipped to deal with the issue today as it was when people dealt with issues differently. A subpoena used to mean something in the old days. You know, contempt of Congress used to mean something in the old days. But if you can destroy enough of the institutions in terms of everybody does it, and it doesn't really mean anything, and so what if it's illegal? I mean, it's not that big of an illegal problem. You talk about campaign finance. It says very clearly in the statute that you shall take no contribution from a foreign national. Well, obviously, money was taken from foreign nationals. You'd kind of like to know why people didn't realize that's in the statute and why they didn't have a check system to cover that. It says very clearly with every state that you have to be a citizen to vote. Turns out pretty clearly there are a lot of people who aren't citizens who vote. So you'd like to kind of find out how they wound up in the system. You inevitably have to ask those kinds of questions in oversight operations. But when you ask a simple question like who gave the money, when, and how, and it becomes this rope-a-dope technique of stretching out, no, it didn't happen, whoops, we found this, 2 years later we found that, it is impossible to put a focus for the purpose of investigating to try to change the laws. It becomes something else. And if it's very slow kabuki theater, it doesn't work on TV. And people still think they can utilize that kind of an approach often to expose the problems. We got folks who have understood that if it's single frame exposure over a long period of time, people don't see it unless you put that time-lapse photography together. You can do it with photography. You can't do it with congressional hearings. My concern is that there is a general disregard for the process on all sides. We are going to do a better job of oversight as we are learning our job of being the majority. It takes a knowledgeable staff. John Dingell didn't become John Dingell overnight. His staff didn't become John Dingell's staff overnight. They had 40 years to hone, and he's literally been there 40 years, their approach. What we're going to try to do is continue to develop staff that have an understanding of what is and what is not appropriate. We're going to do our best to try to create a structure for oversight that asks the kinds of questions that are supposed to be asked up front, so that you can use that as a guideline as to where you're going and how you're going to get there. But frankly, the most difficult thing for Congress right now is to try to figure out how to take its traditional tools of requiring people to be forthcoming, subpoenas, contempt, and the rest. They simply aren't tools that are very usable in the current climate of everybody does it, and by the way, it is now executive privilege, and by the way, we can't find them, and by the way, you're destroying all of these people. Why don't they're running up enormous legal fees. Why don't they just sit down, be honest, be forthright, and they wouldn't need all of those legal fees to dodge sitting down and saying what happened, when it happened, and under what circumstances. Now, if you take an honestly structured oversight hearing with clear goals and an understanding of what needs to be achieved, with people who are either going to resign because they didn't do what they were supposed to do fairly, or are willing to allow us to have an understanding of what happened so we can change it, then I think you'll find that the structure will work. With the current arrangement, it will not, and my worry is that it will get worse before it gets better, because there are egos that will continue to think that they can become even greater egos if they could just get it right or get the gotcha quite right. As a matter of fact, and I will tell you, I've been a little disappointed with some of my colleagues. As you know, we gave the president the line item veto, and then he didn't exercise carefully the line item veto, but we also have several of our colleagues who are now not running the Golden Fleece Award, but running the item most likely or should be a line item veto. Senator McCain comes to mind, and he listed one of my items. I sat down with him and explained to him what we had done in terms of clearing it. It was the sale of a surplus building. As a matter of fact, I was doing the bizarre thing of putting it out to bid to the highest bidder, with GAO controlling the bidding with the minimum bid. Once he understood what it was, he then apologized, and I said, you don't need to apologize, just put out a press release equal to the one you put out, saying that as a matter of fact, we made a mistake, and this should not have been on the pork list. He did that, and I thanked him for that. That may be a little bit of the English approach. That is, if you make a mistake, own up to it. There are enough mistakes being made on both sides in Washington for all of us. No one is willing to own up to any of them, and that I see as the primary problem.
Thank you very much, Bill. It would be nice to be able to have a little interaction with our panel, but I think what we'll do instead at this hour is open it up to questions. We have two microphones here on the floor. Why don't we start over here on the left? Glenn, if you'll identify yourselves briefly, your connection with the university here, we appreciate it.
Thank you. My name is Glenn Gritzner. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School and the chair of the Campaigns and Elective Politics Professional Interest Council. Congressman Thomas will also be interested to know that I am from Bakersfield, California. And my question is that oversight hearings are oftentimes obviously arenas within which to air dirty laundry and make unsubstantiated allegations, and I think that's been true on both sides for as long as there have been oversight hearings. And Congressman Thomas, because I'm a constituent, I can agree and disagree with you, and while I agree that it's happened on both sides, I will say that I think that there were some unsubstantiated allegations regarding foreign money and illegal citizens voting and things like that. But what that makes me wonder is, even though, as the current campaign finance reform debate has shown us, Congress is loath to pass laws that limit any of Congress's power, would there be a way to set some broad limits on the bounds within which oversight hearings can exist within? And this is for the whole panel. Any thoughts on, could there be some sort of system, you know, maybe not as strict as the independent counsel laws, but other things where oversight hearings have to remain within a certain level of decorum in order to be justified or even to take place.
It's always tempting to say that you can lay out some ground rules. We'll only have those oversight hearings that follow the Marquess of Queensberry rule, something. You really can't do that. It's based upon a mutual trust and respect, and that given the broad area in which oversight hearings can and sometimes must take place, you don't want to create any artificial boundaries. And I'll talk tomorrow at some length about the fraud and abuse oversight hearings that we had on the Health Subcommittee. As you may know, HCVA had an audit which indicated that perhaps $28 billion had been misspent in the area of fraud and abuse. We could have held an oversight hearing blasting them, and we could have done a lot of it. Basically, what I did was bring the parties together. Bruce Vladeck was at the head of it at that time. And I said, okay, fine. So an audit is because we had been through it with the independent audits on our own. I said, an audit is to tell you where you've gone wrong. So I don't want to talk about what's happened over the past 10 years. How can we go at fraud and abuse? And there was a kind of a general sigh of relief that we weren't going to spend all the time during the hearing kicking around the problems that occurred over the last 10 years that produced the $28 billion. What I was interested in is what is your game plan to make sure that we don't continue doing this sort of thing? That led to our passing legislation, which we thought was going to help them with a lot of dialogue between the bureaucracy and the Congress in the Medicare package. And then after the first year that those laws had gone into effect, we held the oversight hearing that I was talking about to say, is it working? So we created a milieu, if you will, for a positive oversight to solve problems, which I think is what we're supposed to be doing. I don't know that you can legislate parameters for that to occur, because so much of it depends upon the willingness to work openly and trust others. That I think you have to build.
Anybody else have a comment on?
I have one brief comment about that, which is one thing I do think can be looked at, and I have to say from the outset that I know nothing about how this works on the House side, but the subpoena rules on the Senate side, when I worked in the Senate, it was really both for the Labor Committee and for the Judiciary Committee, with which I did a lot of work. In order to obtain a subpoena, you had to have at least one person from the minority supporting the subpoena, so that it was not possible to have these purely partisan subpoenaing of witnesses. And I think that that's definitely one thing that should be explored in terms of forcing the Congress to, for the members of the committees to work together in determining that.
Thank you.
Eric Shapsis, I'm a first year at the Kennedy School. This question is mainly to Congressman Thomas. In some ways, I'm a little bit disappointed with your comments in the sense that you talked about the responsibility of people in government, and yet at the same time you also said that much of our oversight problems is because of staff, and yet you didn't take responsibility as a member of Congress for oversight. I mean, part of the way it works is that staff stands behind their bosses, and then the bosses also stand behind their staff and don't place the blame. But that's not really my question. My question actually goes back to the professionalism of Congress that you started out with. And you talked about getting, the first order of business was injecting some professionalism in oversight. And yet when it comes to issues like investigating your own colleagues on elections and alleged election abuse, you won't go outside of Congress to look at that. Namely, in this Congress, Laura Sanchez, last Congress, Jane Harman. So how do you bring those together that when there's a conflict of interest within the Congress, you won't go outside for a third party, and yet for everything else, it's fine to be professional?
Let me say, first of all, that when I made the comment about staff, obviously committee chairmen have great sway over who they hire and the way in which the staff conducts itself. And I think you have to look at it committee by committee. You can't just judge one, you can't judge the House by the way in which one committee operates. And I'm sure you're familiar with that with your colleagues as well. The difficulty in trying to carry that analogy over to contested elections is very simply that under the Constitution, it is the responsibility of the House to determine its own membership. That is something that you really cannot turn over to a third party, because you have to make a decision as to whether or not the member should sit. Now, narrowly under the Contested Election Act, there are a series of procedures that you have to determine, but ultimately, just as under the ethics of the House, the ultimate and guiding determiner of membership in the House is a majority vote on the floor of the House. That's what controls who's a member of the House. Now, sometimes you have to do it in the right order, because you'll recall that Congress refused to seat Adam Clayton Powell. The problem was he had an election. It was over other issues, and the court said, no, you have to seat him. Now, once he's seated, Congress can do anything with him that it wishes. The House could have then thrown Adam Clayton Powell out by a majority vote. So when you have that kind of explicit responsibility and authority in the Constitution, you really can't turn the decision over to a third party, because then you would have to make the decision as to whether or not the third party investigated the way you thought it should have been investigated, and whether or not the information was there. It's one of those inherent jobs, not the most pleasant, but one of the really important ones, peer group review, that frankly most groups don't do as well as they should. But Congress is inherently charged with doing the peer group review.
My name is Sammy Leiba. I am from the Graduate School of Education, but I'm a cross-registrant here at the Kennedy School. And my question is for the first three panelists. None of you mentioned anything about cooperation, or the cooperation end of it. And Congressman Thomas talked a little bit about the time it takes. You have, with Watergate, it took less than a year before we knew the whole tale. With Iran-Contra, it also took less than a year before we basically knew. With the Travelgate, for instance, we had 3 years, and documents were still being requested. Finally, I mean, over 2,000 documents were still being withheld. Within those, we found the file, Billy Ray Dale's file, or that his file had been requested, along with 900 others. So these things came out. And why weren't they turned over? What is there a problem there? And is there also a problem with the use of executive privilege? More documents and conversations were claimed executive privilege by the Clinton administration than by Reagan and Bush combined. Right. And I realize there are a lot, maybe there are just more scandals or fires to be put out, whatever. But is that a problem? I mean, if the president is claiming executive privileges over conversations that the First Lady had with someone else, is that within the scope? A lot of questions.
I think that was sort of directed at me, Phil.
I think you were the first of the first three. So.
I see, okay.
Ricky, I'm going to have Harold handle this to you.
Well, I'm not as conversant as you are with the statistics as to the amount of cooperation or the amount of times this administration has claimed executive privilege as opposed to others, and Phil may have more information on that than I. I will say the following, that the president directed us, when I was there, and has continued to direct his staff to be as cooperative as possible. There are legal principles which Phil Heyman is much more qualified to discuss than I, but there are legal principles that cannot and should not be compromised, and that have to be looked at very closely in determining what should be produced and what should not be produced. I think, however, it is fair to say that this administration has been as cooperative and, in my judgment, more cooperative than prior administrations have been with respect to the turning over of documents. There was, I think, in the Iran-Contra issue or investigation, a diary, a fairly important diary, that was known about for well over a year before it was turned over. Some may say it was withheld deliberately, others by inadvertence. It's a judgment that others can make. If you look at the number of subpoenas, and I don't happen to know the number, but the number of subpoenas that have been served on the White House alone, I can speak to the number that have been served on me personally, the number of documents that have to be gone through to be reviewed and determine whether or not, one, they are responsive to the scope of the subpoena, and then number two is whether the subpoena, in many cases, we think has been overbroad and has to be narrowed and has to be tailored. I mean, basically, a number of the subpoenas are being used as fishing expeditions. That's not unusual in litigation. Lawyers do that all the time. But the mere fact that a subpoena is drafted by a congressional staffer and sent down does not mean ipso facto that it is a legal subpoena, that it is a subpoena of proper scope, and it also does not mean that it can be complied with automatically. I mean, the White House, the business of the White House, or any agency has to go on and should go on, and the process of complying with subpoenas is not something that is done at the snap of your fingers. But I think that if you look back at the cooperation of this administration, it has been very forthcoming in that regard. I was interested in the Congressman's plea that we just walk in there and sit down and tell the truth. Well, I think that virtually everybody that I know, at least, has gone to the Congress and told the truth. You talk about the game of gotcha. The fact of the matter is that in many cases, in these Whitewater and campaign finance hearings, what it seems to us on the receiving end they're trying to do is to catch you on perjury. You go in, you sit down, and you give a deposition. I gave 3 days of deposition to the Senate committee. Well, that wasn't enough. Then I had to come up and testify. Well, they wanted me to testify because the Congressman quite rightly points out they want to get a little show on trial, a little trial on the evening news. They didn't ask me a question, not a question, on television that had not been asked in 3 days of deposition, 2 of which were conducted by Mr. Madigan, who's the chief counsel and a very well-known litigator. So in terms of the number of the documents, in terms of the time that it takes to go through this stuff, it has to be done in a systematic way. What is interesting is that the congressional committees don't cooperate with one another. You have congressional committee on the Senate side, and now we're going to go through this, plow the same ground over on the House side, asking the same questions, looking at the same documents, calling up the same witnesses, day after day, week after week, month after month. If you have an open-ended public purse, it's fine, you can do that. But there is literally no cooperation. That goes to the Whitewater investigation as well as to the campaign investigation. So it seems to me if you're talking about, you know, some sort of reform in this area, I quite agree with the Congressman. I don't think you can draw guidelines. I think it's probably good judgment, good sense, and public opinion and press opinion. And I'm really against trying to draw guidelines because I think you end up just getting yourself in a box on them. But in terms of just the repetition alone and the cost and expense of that to the public purse as well as to the people who are on the receiving end of them, I think there could be certainly more cooperation in that regard.
You sure? Me first?
Okay.
Okay. I don't know I don't really know what decisions have been made to turn over documents or not to turn over documents, but I think you have to take very seriously whether the hearing, whether the oversight is highly partisan. Chairman Thomas referred to oversight hearings which were intended to be very constructive. It would have been fine if they were intended to explore why things had gone badly in the past. In that, you ought to be, the committees holding the hearings ought to be able to demand complete cooperation and prompt cooperation and a minimum claim to executive privilege, et cetera. But if they are highly partisan, if they look very much to the people in the administration as if the effort is to score points, destroy the administration, undermine the institution, you're simply going to get a much less cooperative attitude. And so I think you have to think of those as two different settings. And you can't hope for the same cooperation in a highly partisan attacking setting.
Problem is that anything you ask becomes highly partisan to these people. They immediately charge it with, you're trying to get me. that you aren't trying to carry it out in a responsible way. One of the reasons those other investigations took a much shorter time was that there were actually people in positions of responsibility who thought they had a moral responsibility to tell the truth. What we find in this structure are people who stonewall it, who are willing to go to jail, who somehow are either clearly not willing to follow what is appropriate. You heard the long, elaborate procedure in terms of subpoenas. Either the FBI, the Justice Department, the White House staff are incompetent in their ability to pull materials together, or there is a clear disheveling structure that they have understood controls the system. I will just tell you, in terms of being caught up in the system, the Speaker of the House of Representatives finally wound up paying $300,000 because of a mistake he made in the response to the charges, not the charges, but in the response to the charges. So clearly, the business of trying to catch you in trying to respond to it is striking. I will tell you that we now have one case study, I believe, that's developing that we can compare. The past 4.5 to 5 years, which apparently continue to go on because people behave particular ways, and what unfortunately I think may happen to Secretary Babbitt. I believe probably there will be an independent counsel named. Remember, this was the fellow, I think, in the '88 presidential race, was the one who was willing to stand up, be identified as an individual about what he really believed in. I think he's honest, and I think he's going to get caught because he made a statement, and then he made another statement, and he said, yeah. He didn't go on the way these other people do, beginning to dishevel and carrying on in a way that would string it out far enough that the people's focus wouldn't be together. He actually allowed two statements to be juxtaposed at a time that people could focus on it. And I think he's going to have a very difficult time in his public career because of it. And I think that's one example that you can take a look at, an honest man, Bruce Babbitt, and what's going to happen to him in terms of the structure versus what's been happening for the 4.5 to 5 years of those people who are better skilled at not being honest.
Could I just, I don't want to belabor a lot of the innuendo that was.
I'm sorry, I didn't think it was innuendo.
Well, Congressman, it depends on how you look at things, I guess. And I'm not going to belabor the innuendo. I just want to come back to what I think is a more fundamental point, because I quite agreed with your point earlier, Congressman, where you talked about, I think, the HICVA example, where it was decided that you weren't going to spend an inordinate amount of time rooting around in the wrongdoing, or wrongdoing may be the wrong word. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No.
But
The past.
The past, but basically looking at, there's a problem here, it's not working, and let's try to meet together in reasonable circumstances, come up with a proposal to go forward, and then have oversight with respect to that proposal to see how it's working. And my hunch is, I don't know that, my hunch is that a vast majority of the oversight and investigations conducted by Congress are conducted in that spirit and all to the public good. What bothers me, quite frankly, and I'll put Whitewater aside because I think it's a sui generis case, is the campaign finance hearings. I think that we all know what the problems are in campaign finance. And it strikes me that if there were a serious attempt, bipartisan attempt, to try to deal with the problem, there's some very serious problems and some very difficult legal issues that have to be dealt with on independent expenditures, coordinated campaign spending, etc., that are not easy to deal with from a policy point of view or a constitutional point of view. But frankly, what has bothered me about the congressional hearings on the campaign finance, I don't think that the issues there or the problems that have been dug up, most of those problems were already known, Congressman. There are some people that may well have given money that shouldn't have given money. There may have been some money accepted that shouldn't have been accepted. A lot of money, $3 million has been returned. But there seems to be, rather than the approach that you articulated in connection with the HICVA example, which I certainly applaud, there seems to be much more of a partisan, highly partisan edge in this campaign finance investigation.
Can I respond briefly? Sure. I agree with you in part. One area, though, that I think is new that we've only recently discovered that I think does need to be investigated so we can better understand it because it is a growing problem, is the question of the money laundering that went on between the Teamsters and the 501c3 groups. That, I think, is a useful oversight to understand how these groups were able to do that and the structures that they used, because that will allow us then to go in and change. The 501c3 are the tax preferred groups that are only supposed to advocate, but there was clearly an understanding of, given the Federal Election Commission rules and the rules governing those groups under the tax code, that they could handle money in particular ways that they thought would allow dollars to go in a direction that otherwise couldn't go. That kind of a hearing, and frankly, I just voted money, and my committee gets to vote other committees' money, to create a subcommittee that will look specifically at that kind of an activity for changes in both the FEC law, which my committee controls, and the 501c3, which is Ways and Means, and I can carry it over there. That kind of information, I think, is really necessary to produce a better campaign finance law.
And Congressman, I'm in full accord with you there, and I would urge that, I don't know what your jurisdiction is, but I think the whole area of independent expenditures and how it is a very murky world that none of us know much about, and that not only in connection with what you raised, but Triad, Americans for Tax Reform, et cetera, and it's an area, I think, that needs more investigation, more information. We have very little about it.
Well, let's try to get two more quick questions in here if we can. We've taken a little longer than we customarily do in our forums, but we've got some important issues here.
My name is Joe Sandberg. I'm a freshman at the college, and my question is for Congressman Thomas. Congressman, you mentioned some of the frustrations that you and your colleagues in Congress have had in the past over maybe a lack of directness in people when they testify. Could you reconcile that frustration with the frustration that people on the other side of the table may feel regarding overly broad scopes in investigations, casting a big fishnet and just seeing if you can find anything, and that the importance of directness and straightforwardness is important both for the people who are investigating and for those who are being investigated?
Yeah, I agree, but it depends on the subject matter. Sometimes you just don't know how to frame the questions, and I can again relate it to an area that I deal with in health, for example. When we began trying to get a better handle on skilled nursing facilities, those are basically entities that were created by the way in which the government was willing to fund particular care. It stifled other developments. We sometimes just had to have hearings to bring people in to start talking so that we could understand the way in which the area worked, and then we could narrow it down. I'll go back to an earlier comment I made. It doesn't make any difference whether you don't have clearly delineated goals or that it is the broad area of trying to understand relationships. It is the intent and the willingness of the parties on both sides of the table to move toward a solution-oriented dialogue. That's the most critical. If it's exposure for exposure's sake, it really is not appropriate oversight or investigation. The real fundamental investigatory power beyond how did you spend the money and was it well spent, and we created this agency, is it doing the job? The really broad underlying power is the power to investigate for the purpose of passing laws. I mean, you don't have to have the law thought up before you investigate, but you at least ought to be able to create some kind of a convergent direction in the oversight hearings so that people can begin to see where you're going. And I think one of the criticisms that's totally valid is that there are some folk who didn't have a well-conceived approach, which is okay at the beginning, but the going isn't the goal. You're supposed to be able to move in a direction to achieve something, and there simply has not been a rigorous structure that goes with the investigation for the purpose of passing laws. You don't have to wind up passing a law, but you have to have some clear direction as to where you're going. And frankly, in the past, there were many examples of congressional oversight hearings that just thrashed around in the swamp. There may be some of those going on now. Our job is to make sure that those don't become the focal point. In fact, maybe they get dried up in terms of money, and those that actually are being done appropriately and proper get more attention and perhaps more funding.
My name's Amy Sullivan. I'm a student at Harvard Divinity School, and I'm also a former staff member for Senator Daschle. And as a former staffer, I find it a little hard to believe the argument that the political hearings are mainly staff-driven. So I know from the experience of trying that I could not make Tom Daschle do anything Tom Daschle did not want to do. So I'm wondering if that's not the main focus of these hearings. In any of your opinions, what needs to be done or what could be done to move away from the politically driven hearings to the more effective, issue-driven, results-oriented hearings?
I have some comments on that because, frankly, in the kind of structure that I indicated, what you find is that it's almost always an investigative hearing, and you have investigators going out trying to discover stuff. You have a lot of attorneys who are trying to shape that, and the goal is oftentimes exposure. And the member who was there at the time of the exposure gets the credit. The investigative kind of staff, and unfortunately many I won't call them news programs, programs that are structured as news programs are similar in nature. They really aren't reporters. They're muckraker kind of folk, and they do it for dramatic effect. That's why I think the issues-oriented hearings are much more valuable, because you tend to have staff who are knowledgeable in the intricacies of the operation, and you try to get to understand what they're doing and why they aren't doing it right and how you can get them to do it right, or what congressional intent was and they're not following congressional intent, and you can try to get them to either do congressional intent or tell you why congressional intent didn't make sense and they discovered that it didn't. That takes a different kind of a staffer. That takes a researcher kind of a staffer more often than not. So when I was talking about the kinds of staff-driven investigative programs, they tend to be different kind of staff looking for different kind of information for different reasons.
Well, if I could follow up then maybe to clarify, if it is ultimately the members who are setting the agenda and deciding what needs to be investigated, what needs to be done to wrest control from staffers and get it in the hands of members who should be able to decide to pursue issue-oriented agendas?
One of the things we did in the 104th Congress was that we studied what happened to the Democrats in the most recent Congresses, 101st, 102nd, 103rd. To a certain extent, the leadership on the Democratic side they no longer controlled the agenda. It was the committee chairman who controlled. In fact, Phil can give you some stories that I can't because I wasn't in the closed doors, in which I'm quite sure the Democratic leadership was totally frustrated with their inability to direct the chairman and the committees in directions that they thought were important. So one of the things we did when we first came in, as is almost always the case with changes of control and pendulum swings, we wound up not giving the committees as much power as they really needed. And as a new majority, there were many people who were still operating with the minority conceptual framework, and that is, gee, if we want to study something, let's create a task force. And there were people who weren't on committees who wanted to be able to investigate areas, so here we were as the majority creating task forces to look at particular areas. I said, hey, I have a novel idea. Why don't we hold a committee hearing? You know, we actually own the committees, and we're chairman, and we can set the agenda, and we can have witnesses come. If you've never done it, you don't appreciate how you can structure that. But also, if you've never done it, you can't appreciate how over time chairmen are able to control not only the agenda of their committee, but the agenda of their party in the House. And so what we're doing is trying to learn the balance of providing more responsibility with committee chairmen. I think also one of the things you need to note in the 104th Congress was that we didn't make the next senior member chairman in every instance. In fact, in one committee, we went down 4 members before we found a chairman. What happened on the Democratic side, I think, and again, there may be some stories that will be told, is that there are people who were there, they sat in the chair long enough, it was now time for them to become chairman, and in fact, they became chairman. That was probably a mistake. It should not have been done. That's one of the reasons, I think, that they lost control. That's one of the other reasons, after maybe 30 or 40 years of our control, I think it's appropriate to allow a change of control, because you do need to redress those kinds of out-of-control centers. It's very difficult to do it while you're in control. It's much easier to do it while you're out of control. One last statement. When we were in the minority, we said if you're a ranking member on a committee, you only get to be there for 3 terms as the ranking member, then it'll rotate. We bit the bullet and carried it over to the full committees. Full committee chairs will only be full committee chairs for 3 Congresses. And then they must give up the power and rotate that chair to someone else. Even in the minority, the Democrats have not yet accepted the concept of term limits on a committee chairman. I think eventually they will. That will be, I think, a major self-correcting structure within a majority, even if it remains a majority, because people always learn from seeing other people in positions of power making mistakes, except, I guess, in fraternities and sororities. But otherwise, they tend to learn from the mistakes that are made.
Bill?
And I just wanted to say that there seems to be something self-correcting, to use the chairman's term, about the highly partisan hearings. They haven't done very well.
Exactly.
They haven't been very politically effective. They haven't held the country's interest very well. Those are, you can go back to Democratic years as well as the recent Republican years. And the effect of them, if they don't hold the public's interest, is to free witnesses to be less cooperative, because there's no penalty if the public's uninterested and if the public thinks the hearing is not held in good faith. So there's something of a self-correction going on that we may see effects from.
If I could just add, just
I think that's true.
take partial issue with Bill Thomas on the seniority question, which I actually agree with the changes the Republicans made, but there are those who believe that over time the Congress will be less prepared because of that to deal with the executive branch, because if that also means not chairman turnover and staff turnover, that they will simply be refurbishing. It's always a plus and minus kind of proposition, but I tend to put the pluses on the side of the turnover rather than on the keeping a long enduring staff, in theory on experience, and they'll know where to go for the information, and the same with chairman. And I'd like to just take up very quickly on what Phil said, because I think that's very true, that the ultimate correction tends to be the Iran-Contra thing that finally fell apart. And while many Democrats didn't feel like it was partisan, many Republicans clearly did. And that's another watchword for all of us, is we tend to, on our side of the fence, somehow find that it's not so partisan what we're doing, but what the other side is doing seems to be very partisan. The public and the press often smell it much quicker than the people initiating the action from a partisan point of view, and I think there's a general discipline. And I think you as individuals and all of us as individuals can have an impact on that process by simply making it clear, whether you work on Capitol Hill, whether you work in the press, whether you're a citizen, to people engaged in highly partisan activities, you don't like it. And it's amazing the corrective that will have. The stunning thing to me in politics was that my best supporters and friends were never the people who wanted to discipline me. They were more likely to cheer you on if you were overstepping the bounds, rather than what they would have done in any other circumstance, and that is simply say, oh, gee, you shouldn't say that, you shouldn't do that, I don't approve of that. But when it was their team that was stepping up to the fight, they tended to cheer them on. And so I think there's a lot of internal discipline that individual citizens, staff, members of Congress, and others can affect in this process. It has an amazing impact on people when you say to them, I really don't care for, when you're a supporter especially, I really wish you'd do it differently. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've taken a lot of time of our panel and of you folks, and we appreciate your coming, and we want to thank all of our panel members for being with us tonight.